Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Curious Realms continuing coverage of the Texas UFOCon here in Jefferson, Texas. We have the great pleasure of being joined by our good friend Daniel Allen Jones from the Vortex. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Chris. Great to be back here.
Always great to see you. It's always awesome having you as MC at these events. You do such a great job, and you were actively here presenting on Texas UFO cases today. Let's get into a few of those.
Sure, yeah, I think it's great to be able to have this type of event. This is the third one we've been able to cover all types of different cases, not just from throughout the state, only here in Texas, but beyond. We had a really interesting overview of the Cape Girardeau case of 1941 by Mitchell Whittington, and it's something that, you know, just goes to show that while here in Texas there are several historic cases, there are so many out there in the rest of the world too. But when it does come to the Lone Star State and these incredible encounters, there's a variety of different things people have seen, witnessed, experienced, encountered. And so I've researched a number of these cases to some extent, either by interviewing people, looking at some of the literature that's gone out there, or gone out and done some field investigative work that shows that, you know, there's some interesting stuff to consider when it comes to the validity of some of these cases, whether it's there are forms of tangible evidence that people have collected, groups, different organizations that have attempted to do this type of work to see what's really going on with some of these things. And so what I've done is I've collated that information and provided a sort of chronology of history behind Texas's most renowned cases. Of course, they're, you know, with it being one of the largest states here in the United States, you know, with so many people, there's any number of UFO sightings, and reports are probably not nearly as close to the number of real sightings people have, just because people don't always follow up with something they had happen to file a report. But out of the ones that we do know are out there that have been documented, there are some pretty incredible things that have happened. So going way back, you know, you can think about some of the interesting cases that, you know, we know from the flying saucer era on forward. But before all of that, one of the interesting things that happened in 1878 was with a farmer named John Martin. And he described an object which used the term saucer to describe a quality of its movement.
Interesting.
And so before we have Kenneth Arnold in 1947 talking about these crescent-shaped objects over Mount Rainier in Washington moving like saucers, which got spun by the media into flying saucer, here we have John Martin in North Dallas talking about, you know, seeing this object that was like a saucer. And so I think, you know, it's kind of fun to say we can claim stake here in Texas to the, you know, original saucers out there. And that just goes to show this dates way back. And so that's kind of a fun bit, an anecdote from 1878 there in the Denison Daily News. And
even before the Aurora incident, which you've talked about so many times at conferences, from 1897.
That's a big part too. Of course, the focus I've had for a long time on my research project has been with the Aurora legend. It's not the only airship story. There are several in Texas that go, you know, ranging from all of 1897. And so that one probably stands out the most. But there are others all over the state, and newspapers at the time were writing all kinds of different stories about what was going on with these airships. Some would describe the crew, some would describe propellers, just more dirigible, real airship type crafts that seem to be made by maybe more or less inventors rather than Aurora's spaceman. But the fun thing is some of these talk about, like one in Merkel, Texas, talks about an anchor that was left in town, and they put it up in town square and had it out on display for a while. And so some of these airship stories are pretty neat to see, because they don't maybe have the sensational exotic quality of it being related to an extraterrestrial, but it does show that many of these places around the state and beyond, of course, we're talking about the airships outside of just the Aurora story. So that, you know, really spans from 1896, 1897. Afterward, there's really not much of the airship wave. It was just something that, you know, really took the whole nation by storm for just about a year or two, and then it died down. And of course, we had the real airships that were, you know, being made, and the public, you know, scope of things. And then of course, you've got the Wright brothers and the Flyer and all that. So modern aviation comes into the picture, and there are a few cases that are really hard to track down, but in the 20s. And the 30s, but my focus with the chronology kind of jumped ahead into the 40s. But I should say that my buddy and author Noe Torres has done a great job and also detailing a lot of the early and hard to find stories in some of his books about UFOs before the 50s and 60s. And so that would be some I would definitely recommend for anyone to check out. Just the stories out there are, not as well known, but they're worth at least making a note of, that this is it's an ongoing phenomenon. But jumping ahead into the 40s, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happened. I do mention how sometimes the Aurora story is an ongoing bit of history, just with the new families moving in and those sort of things happening. So I did kind of detail a lot of those types of things along the way. But most people, when they think of UFOs, they think Roswell, or they think Area 51 and stuff like this. The fun thing about Roswell was that the debris from whatever did happen was loaded up and taken over to the Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth, Texas, close to where I am, near my hometown, and put on display for a public media shoot where, they took pictures, and you have General Roger Ramey and Jesse Marcel holding up what looks like tinfoil, some of those infamous pictures that people always refer to.
Yeah, the tinfoil and balsa wood. And
right.
Yeah.
So, I think it's kind of interesting to note the connection there between the Roswell and Texas Association. So those photos are pretty renowned for people who keep up with the subject, but those were actually taken in Fort Worth, Texas, and some people say that was all hauled off to Wright-Patterson, and you have the Hangar 18 stories and all this. But one of the other interesting side tangents to that was that the idea of occupants of bodies, aliens, things like this, that there were autopsy videos. Apparently, there were some photographers doing video or photography for some kind of occupant or body or alien, however it had been referred to, in Fort Worth. And I think that that's really curious, because that's not really as well known. So a lot of the material behind the alien autopsy that's kind of been around the internet for a while, that spins off of these stories of Roswell and things, does actually involve Fort Worth in some way. And so Philip Mantle, who's a publisher in the UK, has written extensively on a lot of these. He's talked about Pascagoula and these types of things. He wrote a lot and worked a lot on looking into the alien autopsy videos and the legitimacy or anything behind that. So there does seem to be some kind of relationship between Texas and specifically Fort Worth, that there could have potentially been a video made of an alien autopsy, real or fake, in Fort Worth at some point. So that's kind of interesting to think of as well. And going into the kind of more modern time frame after the 40s and 50s, that's when UFOs really, the flying saucer craze really took effect. And
it's when the zeitgeist hit, for certain. Yeah,
and I think that you have a bigger interest overall with the community of people who began to think of this as a field of study and ufology, and started to actually look back at these old cases and think, well, maybe there's something to these historic incidents of strange encounters. So one of the biggest ones at this time, you have a number of things happening in the late 40s, and you even have one in Laredo, which we had Chris Lee James talking about. It was in 1948, and there's tons of different stories like this, but one of the things that really stood out was a few years later in 1951, you've got the Lubbock Lights. And the Lubbock Lights garnered enough attention by Project Blue Book. And this is a program that was put together by the Air Force to study and investigate UFOs. Of course, many people have probably heard of it at some point, or more especially Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was a professor of astronomy, got pulled into this project to help and really kind of dissuade the whole, association with UFOs being aliens and things like that.
This is where we get swamp gas explanations, things like that. Which even he said, these are aberrant explanations. These are far-fetched explanations, but they very well could be. But even he backtracked years later and was like, many of these we have are unexplained.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's enough information to show that Hynek was genuinely interested in the UFO subject and continued on to make the Center for UFO Studies after his involvement there. But he also, I think, found out that a lot of the more serious reports were not just case closed. They were actually going on to different potential bodies of interest. So, there is something to it. And he realized that he was being manipulated for sure. And that'd be a good way to put it. And his son, Paul Hynek, who have come to know is really, trying to help keep the, momentum going, the legacy, the Hynek legacy going in a way that he, is very much of the outlook that his father was not just distrusting of the government, but because of what had happened, he had a distrust for the situation of how things were handled. And so I would say that, that's important to preface the idea of the Lubbock Lights with, because this was investigated by Blue Book in a way that, they had a show, fictionalized show on the History Channel where this became one of the episodes. And it's fun to see just for a show, but the Phoenix Lights is a different thing. The Lubbock Lights, well before it, was something that was seen by a few people, but actually some professors from the local technical college there who were seeing these things and took photos. There are photos out there, and it's kind of a triangular formation of like singular dots that all kind of form this shape. And the official explanation that was given was that these were birds reflecting lights from the town. That they had nude lights installed, and that maybe this was causing some kind of reflection, which, it's not impossible for certain things like birds to reflect lights, I suppose, but this is sort of a far-fetched idea that really put people, questioning whether they should be trusting of these official explanations. And so it makes us wonder, what really was that object? Was it an experimental craft? Was it some other type of phenomenon that's not a craft, a technology at all? Because they were wondering, some people were wondering, are these individual lights something that forms an enormous object, or were they just all working in tandem? So Lubbock's lights were an interesting set of lights that made this weird shape and made people wonder what was really going on, and it caught enough attention for them to investigate it back then. And this just keeps going, into the 50s. You've got a number of different cases where even a few years later, they have the what they called the Houston Batman. Yep. And it's kind of a weird crossover because it's not exactly a craft that we know of, but it seemed to be a strange case of a flying humanoid and
some gargoyle type creature.
Our friend Ken Gerhard wrote about this as well. Basically, some people in the Houston Heights area were looking out and they saw this strange person that was glowing ascend up into a tree line, and as they looked, it seemed to be dark and wearing a sort of paratrooper type of outfit, and imploded in on itself, and then moments later something rocketed up in the sky down the street, and so maybe that was some kind of technological craft or object, but the association is strange, and it's not necessarily that they thought it was a spaceship or an alien, or they didn't really know what to think, but that does fall into the category of UFO in the more general sense that they don't really know what it was. And so it is interesting to see some of those sort of tangential cases like that are outside of the typical daylight disk or something to that effect. So the 50s is kind of filled with some of those interesting cases like that. You also have Leveland as well, which was like an egg-shaped object over in Leveland, Texas, that was disabling vehicles, and law enforcement was out there checking it out. Kevin Randall wrote a book about this recently that kind of chronicles the event as well. Into the 60s, there are a few other things, and I noted one of the interesting documents that surfaced over the years regarding John F. Kennedy deals with his request to be informed on all UFO matters to the CIA just 10 days before he was assassinated. So there's a document out there that shows that he was requesting information about UFOs to the CIA only 10 days before he was killed. And, now that might seem like I'm insinuating that that's why it happened. And, I don't know. I think there's a lot of factors why he was unfortunately killed in public, but it's one of those things that it's hard to look past that as one of the challenges that we face as someone in his capacity as not just an official capacity, but the president of the United States, to be requesting information from an intelligence agency about a subject which has often been relegated to science fiction and the fringe, and which is now ironic because now Congress is all about this type of thing. And the presidents that we've had for a while haven't really been as proactive as maybe people would like with it. And I think there's some reasons for that. But just seeing JFK in a memo talking about this on an official document is pretty neat. And that happened, supposedly about 10 days before he passed away. So I mentioned that because it's part of the history of the officialdom when it comes to the subject too. But up in North Texas, you have places like Sherman, but also in Damon, where law enforcement and other people were witnessing different objects. One in Sherman was like an amorphous object that there's a photo of that law enforcement saw. In Damon, some people saw a triangular craft. And it's just to demonstrate that by sharing these cases that the UFOs aren't always just flying saucers, that they are a variety of shapes, and that there are statistics that have been done to show that things like triangular UFOs are actually pretty common, or more common than people realize. And so there are a lot of different interesting cases like this out there, and kind of trailing through that late 60s into the early 70s. This is kind of the time frame when the Aurora story was getting publicized again and became back into public awareness. And when you have a story about not just a sighting, but specifically a crash, material, debris, wreckage, bodies, burial, and that's exciting for a lot of people who are interested, because at that time, ufology in its own respective sort of field had already been catching a lot of attention to people who were into it at the time, enough so that people hearing about the Aurora story, which was being written in the newspapers and things, they said, wow, I think I want to go and be able to look into this. It wasn't just a one-time thing that people saw in the sky and that was it, but apparently the story suggests a lot more. And so in that time frame, the late 60s, early 70s, you had people descending upon Aurora, as we've talked about in other shows, that wanted to go and try to do a little bit of treasure hunting and metal detecting and see if there's really anything to it. And in extreme cases, try to really see if there's an alien body there.
Literally dig things up.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I think it goes to show that the idea of UFOs and moreover crash retrievals, non-human intelligence, bodies, these types of things like this, the evidence is what people are always after, and these stories kind of insinuate that there is something to it. And I think it gives people hope. It gives people the inspiration to kind of look into that. And I think that the resurfacing of the Aurora story helped to really jumpstart a lot of interest in a way that people took this non-tangible subject into a way that became like a really interactive type of part of their life, that they can go out into this place and do something about to the best of their ability. So it's interesting to see that. Of course, into the 70s, there's a lot of other curious things that have happened. Another similar, or at least interesting type of events that took place was down in South Texas, near the valley down there, Raymondsville, Brownsville, and San Antonio. They all had these sightings in 1976 of what they called the Big Bird. Some people call it the Thunderbird, and people might be wondering how this is relevant, because we often have the connotation of UFO being an alien spaceship, when it really just means unidentified. So people were seeing an unidentified animal flying up in the sky. And the strange thing about this case in 76 was that it wasn't just any animal that they were describing. It seemed to be like a pterodactyl in nature, which is bizarre in and of itself. Yeah,
leathery in appearance. And
you have these weird qualities that people were, and actually school teachers, and there's some interesting articles that were written that have been looked into, and our friend and colleague Ken Gerhard wrote a book. His first book on this was Big Bird, and it looked into these aerial creatures in a way that people were wondering, what are these? Is there really something to the idea of like living fossils still out there? And that's exciting. It seems very sensational in some ways, but people are describing some kind of weird animal that they can't readily identify. So it under that guise does fall under sort of the term of UFO. And it might not be a technical object, but it might be an unknown flying animal or something. So
could be.
There's some interesting ideas of how that does branch over and cross over into cryptozoology, or studies of unknown animal encounters and things like this.
Sure.
So I do think that there are some bridges between different fields of interest. So that's kind of something that you see happen in this in 76, and moving on from there and into the the 80s. I think what's really important about one of the more notable Texas cases is that in 1980 you have two ladies and one of their grandchildren driving on an old road north of Houston, basically trying to come back from looking to play bingo and have a regular night, and in doing so, they look up and they see a glowing object, and they also hear a thunderous sound and see these helicopters, and that's very startling. And the little boy asks his grandma, "What is that?" And she replies, "Don't worry, it's Jesus. It's the second coming." And this is incredible because, unfortunately, it turned out to not be that, unfortunately, and they don't really know exactly what it was, but what they could discern as it got closer and unfortunately came down in front of the road that wouldn't allow them to proceed any further was that it was to their description, sort of a square or diamond-shaped object that was glowing with light or fire or flames almost coming down and burning the road below, and they felt this immense searing heat that started to become very hot and noticeable, and they could tell that these helicopters were with it. The association with those helicopters was really important because, in a nutshell, they saw this thing. They got out of the car for a moment. One of the ladies pressed their hand into the dashboard, and it left an imprint that sort of melted, and that was really a notable quality. Eventually, the strange diamond-shaped object that seemed to be in distress came up, and it went on, and the whole group of helicopters continued on.
Because they reported that it was spewing material, things like that like sparking stuff off of it.
Right, and there are transcripts where you can hear these ladies, Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum and her grandson Colby Landrum. Colby's the only one alive now, but they all went home and they were ending up with their hair falling out, with blisters, throwing up, very sick, and obvious signs of radiation. And I think because of the association with the helicopters, they never insinuated that they thought it was extraterrestrial or alien, in nature. They almost immediately suspected that it was the government or military. Enough so that they attempted to sue the Air Force. And they never really... there's some challenges and discrepancies about the medical situation that happened afterward, but there's a really interesting book about it called the Cash-Landrum UFO by John Schuessler, who had been involved with MUFON for a number of years. He investigated it. There was a clandestine cleanup crew that came up and fixed or changed, modified or altered the road somehow.
A whole swath of road.
And our good friend Ann Walls, who's been involved with some various investigative work, she lives nearby, and she's known some of the people who've lived in that area and were there around the time it happened, and knew about the helicopters and knew about the spot that was left on the road. But apparently that road's been cleaned up a lot. I've been able to go down there, and you wouldn't tell if you didn't know about the story that the road had these things happen. So it's one of the most notable cases, not only just because of the effects that were incurred with these ladies and the kid being in such close proximity to this object, but what's also very synchronous about it is that half a world away at the exact same time, mind you, this is December 29th of 1980. So at this same time, in Suffolk, England, you have the Rendlesham Forest case. This is England's most well-known and well-documented
and
UFO
one
case.
of the most well-documented UFO cases, period.
Right. And I don't know that there's any real direct connection. It's just odd that they happened at the exact same time.
And it's also kind of odd that the crafts have almost the same appearance, that they're both like diamond-shaped.
Yeah, the Rendlesham Forest one talks about sort of a tripod of a landing that was measured, that they did see some kind of impression or like an indentation in the ground that they looked at. And the weird thing about both cases is that you have people who were in close proximity with this unknown object and had some effect.
Had health effects.
And, even the Rendlesham Forest people are not all on the same page about what happened. So one person says he touched the object. This is Jim Peniston. He says he touched it and got a download of binary, which had some interesting thing like coordinates and all of this stuff. And then you have other people, Jonathan Burroughs, who basically had been denied adequate medical attention because they weren't able to reveal the source of the radiation. And the challenge with that is because it was on, a military space that they couldn't just outright tell. So Senator John McCain at the time had to help them in declassifying some of the material that they were able to use to get medical attention. So de facto revealing it was due to UAP or UFOs. And so it's interesting to see what that type of involvement can do in some way. But again, kind of rounding back to the Texas side of things, it does make you curious. If this wasn't an alien spaceship, because it's easy to use that as a way to say anything mysterious is alien, because it's just a catch-all. But in the event that it was like a secretive craft or an experimental type of technology that was using, some people say it came out of Area 51, some people say it was using nuclear propulsion and was, something was going on, it wasn't working right. And you can imagine the people in those helicopters maybe they didn't even have any idea about what was really going on. They're just there to do their job too. And unfortunately, who knows if they got radiated or not, and if they even knew how to describe what it was.
Likely have no legal recourse. The prime example is the families of Area 51, the people of Rachel, Nevada, that actively sued and won a case against the federal government for burning of toxic materials from stealth experiments and stuff. You didn't hear anything about any employees in that lawsuit who were there in the burn pits. You didn't hear about any contractors getting to get their health benefits taken care of in that lawsuit.
Yeah, so it's unfortunate that anyone is having these things happen and doesn't really, maybe they don't have a way to follow up with it, especially, because they can't say where the source of this radiation, if it seems to be radiation, is actually coming from, and that's too bad.
Well, and I mean, that's another prime example. That lawsuit is literally how we found out that Area 51 was a real place. Without that lawsuit, it would still be a place under wraps that's used for military testing. They literally had to say, okay, there's a place there. Yeah, it's called Area 51. We test things there. Sorry you were hurt by the off-burning of materials, but it led to the declassification of Area 51 as a known location now. Before that, it was myth. It was hearsay, It was a totally disavowed location before then.
One of the other things about the Cash-Landrum incident that sort of an eye-opener and makes people, it can open up a ton of cans of worms, but it's the idea that, this makeshift group of helicopters, they said they counted 23 helicopters, and it's like, wow, when would anyone ever see that many helicopters ever? Maybe an air show, but maybe a dozen
if you were part of an incursion force, maybe.
So unless you're actively involved in some kind of
military exercise,
something like that, right? I think that it's hard for anyone to know that they've seen that many helicopters all at once ever. And I think that people wonder, well, that's one thing, but where did they all come from and so quickly, if that's the case, to know that, they were either escorting, retrieving, or pursuing this object, because we don't know if they were actually all together at the start or if they actually had to come in and try to retrieve it or help it out. So there's been lots of rhetoric about the idea that it later came and went off over toward Louisiana or something, well, and that maybe that there's a facility or perhaps multiple facilities that can quickly get these types of numbers out there.
Ellington would have been the closest airfield with anything like that, next to maybe, and I don't even know if at that point, because I grew up in South Houston, or Southwest Houston, right over near Highway 6. My high school, Tully Stadium, was the staging ground for the Air National Guard and National Guard, things like that. Like all their helicopters took off from Addicks Dam right down the road. So whether or not that installation was open at the time, I don't know when that incident happened. But aside from that, it would have been Ellington Field right down the road near where they have the air shows, near Galveston, stuff like that. That would have been the closest military airfield to where the Cash-Landrum incident happened for rapid response of helicopters.
Yeah, I mean, so people wonder, and it's, obviously there's a lot of free association that can take place, and people can be very conspiratorial minded, but it makes people wonder where such a force could be
mounted
set off from, and
rapidly, especially with rapid deployment.
And that kind of makes me, in backing up a little bit, I'm going to backtrack. So
Please.
There's a few other interesting cases of note that kind of help paint a good picture of a lot of the different areas, because Texas is such a huge state. Going back a little bit, in '66, there was a story from Edinburgh, Texas, that deals with some workers from Dallas, but were working in a caliche pit, basically trying to get gravel, and had some construction material and dwellings. And apparently something started happening in the sky that was causing a lot of commotion, and there was an explosion in the sky. And so something apparently happened that started to burn their materials in their dwelling, and they had phoned in the sheriff, and the local sheriff came out the next day with his son, and they noticed that these workers were so scared that they just left, and they don't know if anything ever really happened to them. No one's ever been able to follow up with who exactly these people were, but they described something in the sky that exploded and caused a fire and just destroyed some of their work equipment. And, some of the questions that were raised were dealing with, like, was there an insurance claim filed or anything? But this is in 66, and so this area now is interesting because it's an area that's on a private property that some people own. The city of Edinburgh, for the last 13 or so years now, has been doing a UFO festival and conference to help commemorate the event, but also to bring people out to the location to be at a place that had some strange incident like this to see for themselves. And there might still be some of the burnt and charred material and remains that have been found. I mentioned Noe Torres earlier. He's a local there in Edinburgh. He's sort of the local specialist when it comes to this case, and he's written a new book about that as well called Fire from the Sky. Oh, wow. There's, of course, the movie Fire in the Sky about Travis Walton and his notable abduction experience and all that, but he kind of did a play on the name Fire from the Sky because apparently some of these construction materials and the machinery and the dwellings are all burnt and destroyed. So no one knows if those 8 workers from Dallas got radiated or are okay or even alive now, but that was in 66. A few years later, South Texas area, Palacio basically in 73 had declared that they wanted to do some, UFO landing and invite any visitors, and they had a massive flyover of some weird bubble red object fly over a football game. And then a few days later, they declare that they'll have a landing zone for all, visitors like that. So it's interesting to see some of those, like the declarations from a bit of an official stance on a lot of those types of ideas. And one of the other things I mentioned, we talk about Aurora sometimes on the show, but in the scope of when I mentioned the family moved onto the property, they the whole idea that the crash happened and the debris was discarded down the well and body buried in the cemetery, all that. Well, a new family moved on that property, and the whole idea is that they wanted to use the well, which supposedly had that metal from the airship and all this. They used that well for drinking for 12 years before they sealed it up in 1957. And Brawley Oates and his family, they said that they used the water for drinking and whatever else, and that Brawley Oates basically claimed that he incurred really bad maladies and injuries like arthritis on his hands to what he said was drinking that water that he thought was radiated from the spaceship crash. And he started to come forward with that information in about 73 as well. And whether that's the case or not, I don't think there's any medical records to substantiate that, but he passed away in 78. And and it's interesting, his family has said some things and made comments about how some of his statements may have been taken out of context, but that's what he said in multiple interviews.
It's hard to take it out of context when you directly say, like, this happened to me because of the water in my well and because of the stuff in it.
Yeah, so...
literally the words that came out of his mouth.
I think one of the things people who are into this subject, they hear when someone's affected by something and they say, well, yeah, because, these other cases show that there are people getting radiated and there's all these injuries and things like that. So, I mean, if that's really happening and it's easier for people to associate the idea of being too close to something will cause some problems, then it makes sense in that point of view or that line of thinking to say that, well, maybe Brawley had something happen, but that took place in the 70s as well. And then, of course, they had that pretty campy movie in the 80s that came out. Yeah. It's kind of a fun movie like
E.T. It's a larf. It's a larf.
Yeah, and so that was in 86. And, of course, just being the notable airship story that it is, it's one of the most reported otherworldly encounters.
Well,
ever.
And I mean, and all of that brings us directly into the present day, where we're talking about things like the Stephenville sighting, which made national news, much like the Phoenix lights whenever it happened, where F-16s were chasing things around in the sky, stuff like that. Actual radar reports of something in the skies over Stephenville.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the most notable flap in the study of history. UFOs, ufology, all these types of things. When people are referring to a UFO flap, they're talking about an enormous sighting, not just of something seen by one or a few people. In this case, it was a town
of people.
And you have law enforcement, you have various people who you know, have credentials and all this. So it makes people realize, okay, you know, when you have a lot of people saying the same thing, there's something to it. And some people would say it was like a flying Walmart going from horizon to horizon effortlessly and just enormous. And so one of the other challenges with this case is that it was also one by association that had military jets with it. And people wondered if, you know, they were pursuing the object or they were escorting it or something. And I think some people had said, well, it seems pretty clear that because of how quickly it was moving, that these jets weren't escorting this object. They were not able to keep up with it at all. And so the jets seemed to be sent out from Carswell, which now, you know, it wasn't Carswell then, but used to be, you know, so you have the joint facility there who originally said that they didn't have anything. Later they were like, okay, well, we detract that. We're going to say we had 2, and then that came 6 and like 10 jets all in the sky. And, you know, this was an object tracked on radar. And for some people, that's considered hard evidence, you know, and I think it's really important to see that.
That is a scientific instrument.
Yeah, it's something that recorded whatever was happening for sure. So it wasn't just a mirage.
Yeah.
You know?
It wasn't just a mass hallucination by a bunch of people seeing a flying Walmart.
So, you know, I think that what's really incredible about that is that you have people that were in MUFON at the time go down there, talk to everybody, and there's a lot of other individuals who were involved as well, but Ken Cherry, who was the Texas State Director for MUFON for a number of years, along with people like Assistant State Director Steve Hudgens and a lot of other folks who came in, James Chatley, who was a field investigator, they were really interested in trying to help get this information out there. The challenge is that you basically have MUFON, who, as an organization, was upset with Ken and some of the other people for releasing and doing public press releases ahead of the release of information about the case report for MUFON. And because of this, you have a massive falling out of MUFON. You have several state directors who were asked kindly to put that way to let them go. And so Ken went on to form a new group called EPIC. I actually got involved with that's how I found out about a lot of these things going on. And so that was really interesting. But yeah, Stephenville in 2008, which is southwest of the Fort Worth area, about an hour and a half. And you know, this is something that people say that they're doing maneuvers out there. There's military things happening. And I think it's something that, you know, people can still learn about today because it's been seen on some of the recent productions like the Encounters show. And it's something that people can see, like, there's a lot to this. So, you know, I think, and Ken wrote a book called The Stephenville UFO, and there's a lot, you know, you can learn about that wasn't really as public or published at the time as well. And, you know, so Texas is full of these really interesting things. Leading up to today, most of the time, people share about Starlink and things like this. And that'll be tough for people, I think, still for a long time to start to come to terms with, like, okay, this is a regular thing we're going to have to learn about. Managing a group, the Texas UFO Network, it's got thousands of people, and the most common published thing on there is probably Starlink. And
I would say so.
Tough.
As a member, it's definitely that and stars. That and stars. It's
helpful because I think people can use it as a learning opportunity and a point to realize, okay, you know, UFO is subjective. It's not just always going to be the exotic things that we want it to be.
That's right. Well,
but it's helpful for people to see, okay, maybe there are ways we can just explain it in a way that's not always wanting to look at it in that exotic way.
It's like we've said numerous times during this episode. It's like we said numerous times with you on the show before. When you disclude something from the scientific data set, does not mean it's not still part of the science. It's now a more integral part of the science. It's part of the known quantitative, which now only leaves the anomaly.
Right.
So when you put something in the category of known quantitative, don't be sad. Don't be sad. You've still contributed to the scientific data set of the anomaly.
Right.
More so than actually a picture of the anomaly, because now we have a better way to classify known quantitative. We have one more piece of evidence that shows known quantitative and how to rectify that.
Yeah.
That's hugely important to the science of the unknown.
And I'll just make a quick mention, just kind of coming full circle. You know, the history of some of these ideas does date back. And what I should have mentioned way at the beginning was, of course, the Marfa lights. And I'll just mention this because it's important that it wasn't just a singular issue, because people can go still today and go check them out.
I have video of them.
Yeah.
I have video of them and my own hypothesis of what they may be. But I have video of them and I've seen them. And my wife is not a believer in things like we are necessarily. But she saw them, Daniel, and her response, like we literally recorded an episode on the way back from seeing them. And she was just like, I'm flabbergasted. I don't know what to say because this is not something I'm into.
Well, yeah, I think, it's just important to mention in discussing all of these things because not only is it, early before the airships and all that, it's not maybe your typical UFO by way of being that I think is a technical craft way up there. They're way out in the desert. It's a light phenomenon. Some people associate it with paranormal activity. Some people say it could be geophysical. It could be, a lot of types of things. Maybe piezoelectricity with the tectonic plating and all this. So a lot of interesting considerations, even scientific investigations, and even people mistaking car headlights for the actual light phenomenon too. So there are a lot of ways that people have interpreted it. And the thing is that it's not just one of those one moment type things where we look back. So I just say that because it's still a place you can go to today for anyone who's interested. You can always go check out these interesting historic sites and learn about something that did happen once. But you can also go to Marfa and go find some interesting things that are currently active, whatever they are.
With a repetitive experience.
There's not many places in the world like this, but we're fortunate here in Texas that, if you're willing to drive way out there, you can enjoy
worth the 8-hour drive.
They have a 24-hour rest stop with a little observation deck so you can see out there. And it's really interesting. And I'll just say that, along with that, there are currently a few great events that help to to bring awareness to some of these historical cases.
Absolutely.
I mean, here we are at the 3rd Texas UFOCon. But there are also some pretty interesting things. The Edinburgh case I mentioned earlier does have an event that's a long-running event as well. They have a great festival and conference, and I think that anyone who's interested in, connecting with other like-minded individuals and learning about some of these things to show up and to do what you can to, take part into the discussion and to really help, I think, provide a supportive network for people to feel comfortable in engaging in this otherwise challenging topic to get into.
Yeah. So. Daniel, thanks as always for your time, man. It's always great chatting with you, always great catching up. Let everybody know where they can go to keep up with all your work, where they can go to get onto the Aurora Wiki about the Aurora crash. Also, where they can go to follow the Vortex and everything you do, bud.
Sure. I'm pretty accessible on most social media platforms. You can just search my full name, Daniel Allen Jones. I also manage the Vortex media platform. You can just go to the YouTube channel on there. And the Aurora Legend is my latest endeavor for research projects. That's something you can go to at auroralegend.com, and it's just chronicling all the history of the legend and all the ways that it's been portrayed in media. And there's just going to be constant updates with that, and I'm glad to be able to help out. I know we've both been really involved with a lot of media and events and things, and so any of the presentations that were given today will eventually wind up on the Vortex, and you can see some of the past ones also on Curious Realm, and I'm glad to be able to kind of work in a way that's helping to share this information along with you, Christopher. So
absolutely,
again, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're an integral part of this mission, my friend. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning into this segment. Make sure to stop on by the Vortex online. Make sure to stop on by the all-new Aurora Crash Site Wiki. While you're online checking all that out and getting a hold of Daniel Allen Jones, make sure to stop on by Curious Realm. CuriousRealm.com is where you can like, follow, subscribe, share, comment. That's where you can find us on just about every audio and video platform out there. Stay tuned through this quick break. We will be right back with our continuing coverage of Texas UFOCon right here in Jefferson, Texas, right after this.
The key to good science is good research. At the heart of good research is a good data set. With the field observation and encounter log from Curious Research, you can easily keep track of your investigative information all in one place, making it easier to review cases and readily see comparisons and contrasts between them. Whether out in the woods squatching, in a back room gathering EVPs, or using high-tech gear to track UFO, UAP activity, this easy-to-carry, pocket-sized scientific data log is the perfect companion for any field researcher. You can find your copy of the Curious Research Field Observation and Encounter Log at Amazon.com or visit the official Curious Realm store at CuriousRealm.com/store to reserve your copy for yourself, your family, or a mind that you want to open. That website again is curiousrealm.com/store.